we are back on the 0 Hour. I, as always the case, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. I'm looking forward to talking to my next guest. I've been reading him for a long time. Ben Burgis has written for a number of publications, including Jacobin, which is where I see him most these days. He is the host of Give Them an Argument, which is also the name of his first book, and he is also a philosophy professor. So we crossed paths recently, which we'll explain in a second. But first of all, Ben Burgis, welcome to the 0 Hour.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Richard.
Oh, well, I've been looking forward to it. And when I mentioned we crossed paths, what I was referring to was, as you know, a couple of weeks ago, I had Matt Taibbi on the show. Matt, consider him a friend. He's been on the program a lot because Matt had basically kind of bitch slapped Herbert Marcuse, the German-American philosopher who was very influential, especially in the 1960s for the New Left. And then, of all things, you and three other philosophers had a conversation about that conversation. So I don't want to have a conversation about your conversation about our conversation. That's too meta even for me. But I did want to talk to you because you are both like a very, in my view, very grounded and rational and strong advocate for genuinely left causes. And you're a philosophy professor. And I just thought it would be interesting to talk about the relationship between philosophy as a field and the left and activism, because I think a lot of people in their minds think those are like polar opposites. Philosophy is sitting on a mountaintop contemplating the meaning of meaning, and activism is down there in the streets. We ain't got time for that, brother and sister. We got to go. And I guess I would start by saying, what are your thoughts on that, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly many areas of philosophy that there aren't necessarily going to be immediate and obvious points of connection to any kind of left political project, which, by the way, I think is okay. I don't think philosophy needs to earn its keep, by being politically useful. If anything, I think sometimes in some contexts, the relationship runs in the other direction, that one of the reasons that we want a society in which everybody has a lot more free time and a lot less financial stress is so they can spend their time, making art or, doing various other things or thinking about interesting, things that are just of interest to them as human beings. So I'm perfectly happy to defend abstract esoteric philosophy in those terms. But that said, I think there is a lot of I think there are a lot of cases when philosophy can be politically useful to a left project. So I think most obviously in terms of arguments. So in terms of trying to think harder about why it is, well, both to persuade people, but also just to think harder about why it is that we believe what we believe, trying to sort out what's important to us, how ideas that have been relevant or important, to the socialist left, might fit together. That, like, I think all of that stuff can also be politically useful.
What led you to philosophy in the first place? What, there's a rich banquet of disciplines to study out there. What drew you to that particular one? And within philosophy, do you have a particular focus?
Yeah, so, I think that, more than anything, it was just sort of, trial and error as an undergraduate, that, I'm somebody who wasn't necessarily always that focused on academics. I started out as a community college student. I think I could safely admit this many years later to having been enjoying the getting high and skipping class parts of high school too much to, to have been that studious, back then.
You ain't alone. Yeah.
Yeah. And in college, I took a little bit of time off in the middle. I transferred a couple of times, but I think in that process of trial and error, I think sort of doing what you do in philosophy, kind of looking at superficially very similar ideas, seeing how they're different, and how you can put them together, always appealed to me, and I just kind of fell into it in that way. And within philosophy, as far as the academic specialization, what I wrote my dissertation about, for example, was about the philosophy of logic. So these sort of logical paradoxes. If I say, like, there's a principle of sort of classic, like, Aristotelian logic that says everything's either true or untrue, and there's another one that says nothing's both. But if I say, like, what I'm saying right now is false, those two principles seem to come into conflict. Right. What should we make of that? So that's what I was doing there. And of course, that's on the more esoteric end of possible topics. And I should also say that for a long time, my interest in philosophy and my political commitments, which were always there, were on very different tracks for me. It's really only in the last few years that it sort of belatedly occurred to me that there were things that in all of these years of thinking about how to break apart philosophical arguments and see if they work and put them back together again, that there was something there that I could introduce other people to on the left that that would be helpful to them for political purposes.
And so your first book, Give Them an Argument, I think was, which I read, I think some time ago, but I think it was an act of, applying that for other leftists to see how they can maybe state their cases more clearly and perhaps even articulate it to themselves more clearly, right?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that part of where that book came from was that it seemed to me that there was this really bad, like, kind of almost a vicious cycle that happens where some of the most annoying people in the world make a big deal about using at least the rhetoric of rigorous or logical argumentation. Like, this is a tradition that goes back to, like, Ayn Rand, making a big deal about saying that
right.
A is A, and sort of suggesting that in some way, laissez-faire capitalist political conclusions followed from that, and goes down to today to figures like Ben Shapiro, who will say things like, facts don't care about your feelings, implying that he's somehow just sort of logically extrapolating his moral and political conclusions directly from the facts, whereas fuzzy-headed leftists are being guided around by their feelings. And there's a bad dynamic that happens when people like that love to use certain terminology that's derived from the study of logic, and then a lot of people with better politics hear that and react to it by rolling their eyes and like having kind of a negative opinion of using that kind of terminology, of caring about that sort of field of study, which I think is a mistake. I think it's a mistake for a couple of reasons. One of which is about persuasion. That of course everybody is a lot of people on the left now will say things like, "Oh, nobody's ever really convinced," by arguments. But I think that that's almost never true. Like, actually, almost everybody is, at least sometimes. It would be deeply strange if you'd never changed your mind about anything, or if you just did it randomly. You didn't have reasons. All an argument is laying out the reasons, for thinking something, and oftentimes, especially, I mean, when people will tell me this. Like, especially if I actually know them, it's often amazing. It's like, hold on, you're going to tell me that nobody ever changes their mind because arguments, like, I know you you were raised in like a conservative evangelical household. You became an atheist when you were watching Richard Dawkins videos when you were 17. And, you were just a regular MSNBC liberal until 2016 when Bernie ran the first time. And then you joined the DSA, and now you're like halfway to Maoism, and you're going to tell me that nobody ever changes their mind. Clearly people do.
And of course, in telling them that, you're also changing their mind, meaning that it's a kind of meta conversation that's replicating its own assertion as you make it.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think it is useful, without pretending that anybody is a purely, rational being who doesn't have all sorts of reasons besides arguments, for these shifts. Arguments are clearly part of it, and it's a tool that we should have at our disposal, and something that I think it's important to get right. And I also think it's good because if, for a reason that you kind of hinted at before, which is that if our only mode of pushing back against people who disagree with us is either like mockery or moral condemnation, neither of which are anything I regard as a mortal sin or anything. I'm certainly not above mockery, and God knows there are things in the world that deserve to be morally condemned. But if those are our only mode of interacting with ideas that we disagree with, then one problem is that people who are potentially persuadable will very rationally get the idea that we actually don't have a good response, to the other side's argument. And another problem, and this goes back to your point about trying to figure out, even in our own minds, what we think is right, that when disagreements arise on the left, which they have, approximately once every 15 minutes since the French Revolution, then if these are the only tools at our disposal, then we're going to just turn those tools on each other, right? Our only way of hashing out these internal differences, will be mockery or moral condemnation. And, you can log into Twitter any day of the week and see what that looks like. But I don't think it's a very appealing image to project to the rest of the world.
Twitter and logical argument are not necessarily compatible, he said, understatedly. But, and Ben Burgis, this is interesting to me because it strikes me that there are also times, particularly within the left, where to use a kind of logically constructed argument pisses people off. It's reactive. I'll admit this is a sensitive topic that I've engaged with people on, but one of the issues that comes up in debate about class versus identity, for example, which is, kind of a hot, a danger spot for the left right now. But, some people will say to me, well, older white men run the world and they've ruined it. And I'll say, well, there are poor older white men living in communities with poor men of color, women of color. They didn't do it. We should do something for them. Or I just tangled with somebody last week who I like and respect, but the older generation screwed us. And I didn't react because I'm part of the older generation. I reacted because in both cases, I think, if I remember my terminology correctly, it's an association fallacy, right? It says the country is run by older white males, older generations are in power, therefore everyone who is a white male or is an older person is in power and it's their fault. And that is corrosive to what I would describe as class solidarity. Highly corrosive, and I think in some cases exploited by those who don't want to see class solidarity, but a lot of times it's unconsciously replicated as an emotional thing. But if I try to push back on that, I don't get, nicely crafted argument. I admire your logical structure here. I basically get F off, old man in my case. So, what do you think? What do you do in a case like, I would say that's probably an example of what you're talking about, right? But I'm not sure how to get past that resistance, or if it's possible or worth trying.
Yeah, I guess to start at the end, I think whether it's whether it's worth trying has to be a case by case basis.
Right.
You have to you have to pick your battles, or you'll just make yourself crazy. But yeah, I mean, I think that certainly is a big problem. That, I mean, it's not a kind of identity politics I hear people talk a lot about, but I think it's a kind of identity politics that's like very big in the left right now. Is this age based identity politics, which is silly on its own terms, right? Like when we talk about people losing their life savings accumulated over decades in the 2008 crash, who are we talking about exactly?
Right.
And it's obviously anti-solidaristic. But I think that, and it is one that some people are very attached to, like to an extent that sometimes surprised me, like how defensive some people, will get about that. But the same point applies to every, identity category that, most white people are not part of the ruling class. That's just mathematically impossible. Most people in whatever category aren't, and I think that this is maybe a place talking about what we can get out of the tools of logic or philosophy that can be politically helpful. And I think one habit that you get out of studying those things that could be very helpful is disambiguation, saying, okay, what are some different possible things that you could mean here, and can we pry that apart, and would that maybe help? Because to get us clear on this and see if we're even really having a disagreement, or if we're having a disagreement, what is it about? And so I think a lot of times when people talk about this identity politics stuff, there's a just rampant failure to disambiguate anything, that everybody's sort of pretty sure that they know what they mean, and they know what everybody else means. But oftentimes those aren't the same things. So that I think that when people on the left criticize what they call identity politics, what they're often thinking about is stuff like the example you gave, or what Matt Brunig will call Identitarian Deference, which is the idea that you should always just defer to what somebody in an oppressed group says, which is a big problem because oppressed groups aren't actually hive minds. That just because people are oppressed doesn't mean they don't disagree amongst themselves like all human beings do. But
and it's very easy for elite groups to find a member of an oppressed group that will advocate for them and then elevate them. We've seen it happen. And yet you get into a false binary, right, Ben Burgis? Because if someone makes an argument like the one we're making, then the response can be and is sometimes, you're racist, or you're insufficiently sensitive to the needs of women or whatever. And in my, look, obviously by my appearance and so on, I assumptions may be made, but in my experience, even when you take special care to frame it in terms of the genuine and longstanding oppression of groups and how those need to be addressed, it seems to always, not always, but at times it flips back to this binary of, if you're advocating, for example, for class, and that there is a diverse member of people within that class, then you're biased against different identity groups. And that binary thinking is another form of, another place where philosophy might be of help, right? I would think.
Oh, no, for sure, right? So this is what I was, that's what I was saying, that I think that oftentimes what people on the left are criticizing, when they criticize identity politics, is the kind of thing we've been talking about. Whereas what a lot of people hear when they hear that phrase identity politics used as a negative is they say, oh, so you must be saying that racism isn't important, or sexism isn't important, and we shouldn't care about these things, which is actually a position that almost nobody really holds. I'm always reluctant to say nobody thinks X, because there's always somebody somewhere who really does, but pretty much nobody does. And in fact, oftentimes what these things are really about is not how seriously you take it, but what you think a a viable solution would be, right? So in the case, for example, of well, okay, so I think like sexism, that oftentimes what these things end up being proxies for, it's not really should we care about wage gaps between men and women? Should we care about women being underrepresented in various jobs or things like that? But it's how should we address that? And one way of addressing it is to like be very concerned with the first woman to do whatever it is, even if that woman might have a political program that's extremely unhelpful to the majority of working class women. But another very different way of addressing it is to say, okay, look, whether Hillary Clinton became president or not, whether Neera Tanden got to be the head of the Office of Management and Budget or not, none of these things are actually going to have the slightest impact one way or the other on the lives or bottom lines of the overwhelming majority of women. Whereas there are like very concrete things that could like universal state-sponsored daycare, for example,
right,
would be something that would actually have a massive impact on those gender wage gaps, because so much of those come from from working women taking time off to take care of their children, and there's also a discussion to be had about cultural expectations and all of that. But like concretely, that would be something that would actually do a lot. And I think there are parallel things on a lot of these other identity axes, right? What's actually going to do more to address the racial wealth gap?
right,
Is it
right,
universalist programs to attack poverty, which would then disproportionately help Black and brown people who are more likely to be poor, or is it to straw man just a little bit here, having like more and better white fragility trainings?
Well, sure. I mean, white fragility is, I've always wanted to do a poll of working Black women, single moms who never know from day to day what their shift is going to be, and how to arrange daycare. Would you rather have a decent wage and a predictable shift every week, or would you rather have a million white people reflect on their own innate racism? I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure I know how that poll would turn out.
Yeah. That's the thing about this stuff too. Like it's so, there's such a tenuous connection between that and anything that would actually like materially benefit any non-white person, because the focus is all on white people, having vision quests about, their own, like internal psychodrama about how they feel about race, which is, it's not, which doesn't do anything to redress the wildly unequal economic distribution between white people and Black people. It doesn't do anything to address, violent and militarized policing, or any of the issues that that we're normally thinking about when we think about that. But it's something that feels like that it feels concrete to people, because they know that could actually happen. Like it's no problem whatsoever to get an HR department to sign on to something like that. Whereas actually doing anything that would take away some of the money of the people who own the company would be a much bigger roll up the hill.
Right. And in that sense, it's an expression of privilege, I would argue. But Ben Burgis, I also wanted to talk to you, since, our landing page and all of this is philosophy. I also want to talk to you a little bit about utilitarianism, because I've struggled with it. I've read Peter Singer and some others. I've always wanted to have them on the program, actually. I just have never gotten around to it. But basically, here's my struggle. On one level, it seems to make perfect sense. I mean, It's the philosophy, as I understand it, or as I would summarize it, where you do what provides the maximum good for the maximum number of people. In that sense, is extremely quantitative in its orientation. It's almost the opposite of what we're talking about now. But I think, number one, it also has inherent biases. And I think to be human is to be qualitative as well as quantitative. So what I struggle with, for example, Peter Singer will write that someone like us with an education of some kind, if we want to do good in the world, he has written, we should go work on Wall Street, make millions of dollars. This is his application of utilitarian thinking, make millions upon millions of dollars, give it all to feed people and give them medical care and so on. And yet I read that and I think, by the way, you shouldn't help, even though he advocates for animal liberation. I mean, you shouldn't divert your money to animal shelters or whatever. It should be maximum saving of human life. And while I get the logic there, I think, number one, to become a Wall Street broker would be to perpetuate and amplify an unjust system and collaborate in it. Number two, many people don't want to live that way, and society should be structured so that different personalities have opportunity to be fulfilled and reach their potential. And I had another one that was really good, but I forget it. So just those two. I mean, what do you think about utilitarianism? I have trouble with the trolley problem. I mean, I don't think it's as simple as people make it out to be. You can throw the switch and save the 5 and kill the 2, but at that point you're a killer. So I think that in real life, these things are trickier. They have to do with the full dimensionality of what it means to be human, which is not just logical calculation, but nurturing the emotional self. But I'm really curious to know what you think about it.
Yeah. So, so there's a lot going on there, but I guess one thing I'd just say, Parrot, that that's not maybe responsive to the main part of your question, but just because I think it's worth saying, is that I think that I'm not a utilitarian, but even on utilitarian terms, I think that Peter Singer, who's written a lot of interesting stuff and I have a lot of respect for, but I think that his imagination is a little bit limited in terms of what could be done about global poverty, and the fact that what he emphasizes is like individual charity as a solution rather than any sort of structural redistribution of power and resources is a problem. I think even on utilitarian terms, you could criticize that. But that said, I do agree with a lot of the criticisms that you just laid out of utilitarianism. And, I'd say, when you talk about logical calculation, that, we want to make maybe a distinction between what the utilitarian says that you should do, which is that you should figure out, how much well-being is caused by an action, how much suffering is caused by the action, and the right thing to do is always the thing that causes the most well-being and least suffering, something like that. And that, when you just say it like that in the abstract, that sounds obviously right. But then there are numerous problems with that. But what they're talking about is like calculating how much what you're doing is leading to good consequences, and calculating how much what's leading to do is bad consequences, and then from there you extrapolate what the right thing to do is. But I think that one of the big things that I try to hammer in the book is this distinction that David Hume's emphasizing between facts and values. So there's no straight line from what the facts are to what we should what we should care about. From how much good consequence or bad consequence something has in this example to whether it's the right thing to do or not. in order to get from point A to point B, you also, it's not just logic, it's also a particular view of morality, that morality just is whatever has the best, best consequences. And I agree, there are a lot of reasons to question that. So, you mentioned the trolley problem. So this originally comes from an example from Philip Afoot, which is about diverting. You have a trolley tracks where there are 5 workmen on one track and one on another, and it's headed towards the one. Can you divert it to it's headed towards the 5. Can you divert it for when we kill the one? But that itself is not the problem, because most people, when they first hear that, their reaction is, yes, of course you should, you should do that. They might question that later when they think about it more, but that's most people's first reaction, in my experience at least. But then the trolley problem comes from a philosopher named Judith Jarvis Thomson, who actually died last year. I'll just plug this. I wrote a obituary for her in Jacobin. And Thomson pointed out, okay, this might sound like just common sense when you have this initial setup. Of course, it's a tragedy that the one person's dying, but it's 5 times as much of a tragedy if the 5 people die. So of course, you should do the thing that'll result in the smaller tragedy. But then she has this twist on the example. She says, well, hold on. What if there's no second track you can divert it to? What if instead there's a footbridge leading over the track, and in front of you on the footbridge there is a very, very large man, and you're an experienced trolley engineer, and you can just tell at a glance that he's big enough that his bulk will stop the trolley in its tracks should you push him onto the tracks to stop it. And of course, even most people who say, yes, of course, pull the lever, divert the train to the tracks, the first example, and the second example, look at you like you've lost your mind when you say that, because they think that that's, as you say, you're a killer now. But then if you're a killer for doing that, if that's wrong, that's murder, to push the large man onto the tracks, then why isn't it murder to pull the lever and divert it in the second one? It's very hard to render those two things consistent with one another. And this is one of a lot of things that I think points to a problem or a limitation of utilitarianism, because it's one thing, of course, to say that clearly we should care a great deal about the consequences of our actions. That's obviously very relevant to figuring out whether you're doing the right thing or not. But trying to reduce all of morality to just this one question of what the consequences are misses a lot of things. I mean, I think you just touched on a couple of big objections to it. So one of them is that it often has these extremely unsavory consequences. Push the man onto the tracks and whatnot, or you're at the surgeon at the hospital. 5 people need organ transplants. You can kill a healthy patient who came in for
sure. I mean, you can take it, and let me give you a real world example of this, because I was around and very engaged in challenging the arguments for torture during the early years of the Iraq War, and the utilitarian-ish argument being made for various forms of torture, and certainly for massive invasion of our civil liberties and our civil rights, was the so-called ticking time bomb scenario, which I'm sure you remember, which basically said you have a terrorist who knows where there's an atomic bomb that's going to blow up New York City, and the timer is ticking, and if you don't torture this guy, then the bomb's going to blow up and 8 million people will die. And that logic was that, first of all, it's never occurred in real life. There's no reason to believe it could ever occur in real life. But that image, that utilitarian trolley-like image, allowed us, I would argue, to become a nation of killers in the Middle East, and to compromise our values here at home. So, you get into this whole, again, it's a sort of, even the qualitative, quantitative gets mixed in with what I would argue is the deceptive use of logic, right? Because it's not a real world analogy, but it's used to allow us to feel okay about committing real world atrocities of our own.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of, I think there's oftentimes a lot of slippage, and people like, Sam Harris, for example, who took this line, about torture between, okay, in this like fanciful hypothetical, it would be justified, and it's actually justified in the real world. And I think you can see that that's a problem without saying that abstract, like hypothetical examples can't necessarily teach us anything about this, but you just have to be careful about extrapolating from one to the other, because even in utilitarian terms, it's far from clear that like the Bush administration's torture program actually stopped more terrorism than it inspired. But that said, you might say that's not our only problem with it. And that gets us down to a problem with utilitarianism, because even if it was the case that it prevented slightly more terrorism, than it inspired as blowback, would that really make it okay? And I think that one thing, a philosopher named Daniel Lubin, who points this out about the ticking time bomb scenario, that it looked superficially like when we say, oh yeah, go ahead and torture the terrorists, that we're making a purely utilitarian calculation. One person tortured, all these millions of lives saved. But I think the more we think about that example, as Lubin points out, that appearance is somewhat deceptive, because we're not making a purely utilitarian calculation. Here's how we know that it's not a purely utilitarian calculation. Change the example a little bit. This time, let's assume that the terrorist is so hardened, maybe he's been like gone through some sort of training to resist torture, that he's not going to crack. That you just don't think that there's any chance that he'll crack, or it'll take so long the bomb will have gone off already. But you realize that you could take his 6-year-old daughter and
right. I've used the same analogy. Right. Or just kill his children one by one until he gives in. Just start, he has 6 kids, just start, right. Exactly.
And if you wouldn't do that, then you're not making a purely utilitarian calculation. Right. Part of your calculation is that you think, oh, it's okay to torture him because he deserves it, because he's a terrorist. But then, of course, when you do the translation to the real life case, now we have a big problem, because if part of our calculation is, okay, you can't do that to the 6-year-old daughter because she's an innocent, right? It'd be okay to torture him. It wouldn't be okay to torture her. Then your principle is it's only okay to torture innocent people. It's only okay to torture guilty people. But if that's the case, then you really have a hard time imagining this playing out in real life, because how do you know who's innocent, who's guilty? I mean, the traditional way of finding that out is to give people trials, where you have prosecution presenting evidence, defense attorneys trying to poke holes in it, but the problem is trials take a very long time, and by the time you've given the prosecution time to prepare their case, the actual trial has happened.
Right.
Any bomb they knew about has gone off 6 months ago. Like there's no the idea that you're going to get actually operationally relevant intelligence from this, while also making sure that you're only torturing guilty people, just doesn't really even make sense on its own terms. So that's like one whole kind of problem with utilitarianism, that has these unsavory conclusions. Another kind that you addressed is that another thing that we typically value besides consequences is personal integrity. So like Bernard Williams has an example that's quite similar to your objection to Singer on Wall Street Bankers, where he says, okay, what if you're a chemist and you're offered a job working for some company that's developing chemical weapons, that are going to be used, against civilians. And it could be true that if you don't take the job, somebody else will take it. But it's not clear that we would regard that as a good enough excuse, that we think that, no, even though it wouldn't actually make a difference to the consequences one way or the other, you do the job, somebody else does the job, there are lots of chemists in the world. We might still think that that's a morally objectionable thing for you to do. And then the other one that you mentioned about how not everybody, is suited to be a life, a Wall Street banker, all this has to do with an idea that John Rawls talks about, that we want there to be room for people to pursue their own individual life plans. And
right, and I think people have picked up from Rawls on that, as I understand it. Amartya Sen or Martha Nussbaum, or a number of people, right? So, and unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it. I wish we could go right from here to what you and I have both written about recently, which is the left's increasing, or segments of what is called the left, that its increasing embrace of censorship, which I would argue is directly related to what we're talking about today, that you might avoid the inconvenience of some right-wing riots, but at what price, right? To us as a society that strives for ethical behavior and as a movement but unfortunately, Ben Burgis, we're out of time, so we'll have to do it again another time. But in the meantime, I encourage people to look up your writing, Ben, Burgis. I get nasty emails if I don't spell my guest's name, who is the author of Give Them an Argument, the host of Give Them an Argument, and writes for Jacobin and elsewhere, and is a philosophy professor. So, Ben, great talking with you, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much, Richard.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the 0 Hour.